versus people who believe in and perpetuate the state's preferred way of thinking.
The origins of the American education system start in the 19th century with reformers, so-called moral reformers, people like Horace Mann and others, who went to Prussia and found a system of education there that they wanted to emulate in the United States, which they did, and they brought it back here. And they established the modern public schooling system and the idea of a modern industrial capitalist curriculum. And they explicitly stated at the time, these reformers who established the schools in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, they said at the time that what we need is to create citizens with these schools, which meant people who knew how to work under industrial capitalism in a factory, and soldiers, people who were willing to fight and die for the country. So they needed to instill in people a regimentation, the idea that people can and should be made into machines, functionaries for a new civilization, a new modern civilization, where there were large factories and large armies. So the school system was designed purposely that way, and that's why we have the bell system, where the students move from class to class through the day, just like on an assembly line, and they are filled with one piece of information here and then filled with another piece of information there. So they become both products of the assembly line and they become the managers of the assembly line, ideally. It's compulsory and universal, the education system. So you are obligated by law to send your child to a school that is approved of by the state. Now, it can be your own school, but it has to be approved by the state. Most of us don't have that luxury for various reasons, and especially poor people and working class people, so they have to send their kids, most of them, to government-run schools, where they are obligated to stay by law from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., no matter what. And if they leave, they are truants. They become criminals, and their parents are liable to arrest and prosecution and imprisonment. And the job of the teachers, sure, is to educate them with whatever the state deems to be a proper education, but it's also to keep them in those seats and in those rooms and in those buildings. If the kid decides to get up and be a free human being and leave that building, the teacher is the first person to tell him to stop, and the first person to call security to force him to stay. That's prison. It's a day prison. It's a minimum security prison, but it's a prison. If I don't send my son to that school, I go to prison, or I can go to prison. If he leaves the school, plays hooky, he will probably get picked up by the police, detained, labeled a truant, and then brought back to the prison.
Services offered by government are not based on voluntary contract. The state expropriates its subjects' wealth by compulsory taxation.
So why are they taxing us at all? That's a good question. I think it goes back to the idea of taxes as a tool of compliance and terror.
A budget is you planning ahead, and taxes is a method of procuring funds. So a budget means I sat down, I thought out my enterprise, it accounts for about this much. This is what I need over this period of time to account for operations. When you have a method of procuring your budget by just yanking more, you get to use ignorant excuses like, well, we're not succeeding, so we need more money. That's not a correlation. Maybe these people are incompetent and they're squandering your money for, it doesn't make sense when you start breaking all the things down.
The corporations don't pay taxes. Business entities don't pay taxes. Only people pay taxes, because a tax is a burden. It's something that we bear almost in a physical, visceral sense. It's a way to ensure that Americans are docile and that Americans are frightened of their government. Because that's the number one interaction most people have with the federal government, is their annual tax form. The amount of tax revenue that government takes in doesn't cover everything it spends. And so to make up the difference, obviously they sell treasury debt. So, as bizarre as it sounds, if a portion of the federal government's budget can be funded by debt, arguably the whole thing could be. We could have no income taxes, and the $4 trillion that the U.S. Fed Gov spends every year could be financed via treasury debt, and then ultimately monetized by the Fed.
Central banks have significant control over the economies they govern. The Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, determines interest rates, controls the money supply, picks winners and losers, and enables nearly limitless government spending.
increasing the money supply, keeping the interest rates low. It turns out that is very beneficial for the federal government. The federal government, whenever they spend more than they take in tax revenues, they have to borrow. And just like anybody else has to borrow, we have to go to the credit markets and we have to borrow at the prevailing interest rate. Well, when the federal government, who has the ability to tax, they already get a lower interest rate than the rest of us. They're able to borrow more when already the servicing on the debt, the interest payments on the debt, are already one of our biggest expenses. With the debt that's, what is it now, $23 trillion. With that kind of debt, anybody else's credit would have run out a long time ago. They are able to keep on doing this because the interest rates are low. So the Fed's role in allowing the government to overspend on all kinds of things, but the biggest one would be military, on these wars, endless wars. They're able to keep doing that because they're just able to borrow at lower rates.
Absolute monarchs, when they got into wars, sometimes they'd run out of money. The treasury would run dry, so armies could not be paid, and they would stop battling in the field and go back. Wars are extremely expensive. Had Americans been forced to pay by taxation for the Vietnam War, it would have stopped a lot sooner than it did. America could simply print money and buy the things it needed to fight the war without having to raise taxes. So it's because it spares people from having to pay a visible price for the war, that the war can go on.
State military conflicts destroy human lives, pollute the environment, impoverish millions of people, and waste scarce resources in pursuit of state political goals.
Regardless of whether they admit it or not, through all sources, about $1 trillion goes to the so-called defense budget. Now, that not only includes the $600 or $700 billion to DoD, but also State Department, a lot of U.S. aid, a lot of other things in the federal budget are really defense spending masquerading as something else. Well, government's too big and we need to cut spending. If they're not talking about defense, if they're not talking about entitlements, they're not being serious. There's no amount of cutting we could do in any other part of the government that would make a meaningful difference.
As Randolph Bourne famously put it, war is the health of the state, right? The state benefits in lots of ways, directly and indirectly, from war. I mean, everybody remembers Orwell's 1984 and the idea that war was so endemic that you didn't even know who the current enemy was. And they kept switching it around, right? So people didn't care. They just knew that they were constantly in a state of warfare, which of course, allows the state to justify a lot of infringements on personal and community liberty that we would normally not tolerate, right? Oh, well, we're in a time of war, so we have to read your emails and we have to spy on what you're doing and make sure that the enemy hasn't infiltrated, our midst. The reason that most people go along with that, albeit, with some grumbling, is because they have been told we're at war. We're at war with terrorists who would want to blow up airplanes and want to hurt you, and etc. So you've got to sacrifice some of your liberty for the security that we, the government, offers.
Well, this is an example of the U.S. government creating problems that it has the appearance then of solving. We created a problem in Libya with our foreign policy of regime change, of the Gaddafi regime. When we did unleash hell on the people of Libya, chaos broke out, as could be expected, as could be predicted, as we predicted. And that also, then that in turn requires more intervention, because you had jihadists moving into Chad and Niger and elsewhere. So you had to create more intervention to solve the problems that your intervention creates. But the U.S. uses jihadists, they use extremists as cat paws. They use it in Syria. They use the most violent Islamist extremists in Syria, places like Syria, to overthrow a completely secular regime, government. And we saw how many hundreds of thousands have died. The global war on terror is ramped up and ramped down on Washington's as Washington needs new enemies or doesn't need new enemies. It's in the most it's fabricated. In the very least, it's something that's created by our foreign policy.